So while we're looking at controllers, you will note that each of these AVR component objects have sort of two buttons. The left one is simply a documentation button. It will simply open the documentation of that specific type of object. So if I hit on an AVR controller script, the documentation button, it will open the class reference of an AVR controller. The second button is the sort of custom Unity events. If you know how mono behavior works, you will these on awake, on start, on enable, and on disable functions should ring a bell, and you can just insert your own sort of custom events in here. A sort of very common application of this is if you want sort of two mutually exclusive modules or components. So say for instance, you want the player to be able to move around in a sort of teleportation manner with the right controller, but also be able to interact with UI also with the right controller, but two actions are mapped to the same button. So if you, for instance, don't want the player to teleport around while interacting with UI, then you would simply give the UI interaction provider an on-enable, which will then disable the teleportation provider and vice versa. If you have ArcVR Net installed in your project as well, there will also be a third button here, and the third button will dictate sort of network behavior and what this object does and how it behaves on a remote host. So as a next step, we want the player to be able to move around the scene and go wherever he wants. So for this, we're going to need an additional ArcVR package, which is called ArcVR Motion. Just open the package manager and just like last time, click add package from Tarball and select AVR Motion, which you download from the GitHub releases. Wait for the import, which should take much shorter than on the core package. There we go. And now you should see it in your in project. And if we now select the controller that we want the player to move around with, so I'm just going to, for the purposes of this experiment, let the player move with the left controller and then grab objects, essentially the spheres out of an urn, with the right controller. So I'm going to select the left controller here, click add module, and you will see that there are a number of new modules now where we have the new package that can be added to this object. So for our purposes, we want a movement provider and a turn provider. Hit update and you will see the left controller now has a movement provider and a turn provider module. So the movement provider is a script that allows the player to move around with different teleportation types. You can see here under movement type, you've got teleport mode and you've got a couple of different ones. So instant will simply instantaneously teleport the player to that specific location. Fade color will simply fade the camera to black or some other color that you choose and then undo the fade after the player has been teleported. This can reduce motion sickness. Dash is simply a sort of quick dash towards that direction. And finally, the fade dash is simply a combination. I'm just going to stick to instant for now. We've got an enable event and an execute event. The enable event is merely what button on the controller you press in order for the teleportation sort of indicator to appear. Then the execute event is the button that you press to actually teleport. So in my case here, the primary axis click middle will mean that if I click on the middle of the primary axis, which is the sort of touchpad on the HTC Vive controller, that will bring up the sort of teleportation arc. And if I click the trigger down, then that will actually teleport me. There's a movement restrictor here, and if you look at that, it's just a scriptable object. You can create your own variation of these, and you can like limit which location is a sort of valid location to teleport to. So in this case, we are only allowed to teleport onto objects that are in the default layer, and the maximum slope is 60 degrees. Then the turn provider is a simple script that lets the player turn. I'm just going to use a snap turning mode. There's also smooth, and we're just going to use the primary axis click as the event to turn. Now, if I were to simply hit play now, you will be just spammed with null reference exceptions in the console. And the reason for this is that the controller is using input, so it will check which buttons are being pressed. And for that, the controller needs an input manager. You may have some projects where you do not need to press any buttons and you only want to track the controllers. That's why this module is optional. But to add it is just the same routine. You select the controller that you want to add it to, you click add module, and you select input manager. If there is no input manager, these other scripts will not be able to work. So if I now hit play, you will be able to see that I can perform these actions. I can teleport and turn around. There you go. As you can see, I can turn around using the touchpad, and I can also teleport in a sort of standard VR fashion. I can, if the slope is over 60 degrees, it won't allow me to. But if it is a sort of flat surface, then I can even jump on top of these boxes or whatever, since they're all in the default layer. So now the player can move around and turn with the left-hand controller. As a next step, we want him to be able to pick up objects and interact with them with the right-hand controller. For that, we're going to need another package. And for that, just as always, package manager, add package from Tarball, and we're going to use the fizz package. Once you've got that in your project, we can close up the package manager and click on right-hand controller. And now there will be a grab provider and a hand interactor module in here. Once again, we're going to need the input manager, so make sure this is checked up here. And then we're going to add the grab provider. There's 3 types of grab providers. If you're just simply grabbing things with a controller, especially spherical objects as we are, then the basic grab provider will do just fine. So if we now hit update, you will see there is our input manager and our basic grab provider. The basic grab provider comes with a grab zone object and a grab spot. The grab zone, if we zoom in on that, is a spherical collider, and the collider determines which objects can be grabbed. So an object can only be grabbed by this controller if it is inside of this spherical collider. Then the grab spot, which is just in the middle here, will determine where this object is being grabbed to or at. And the grab provider object merely just sets which events are being used to grab and release an object. We want to grab an object when we pull the trigger down, and we want to release an object when we release the trigger. So with that being done, we now need some objects that can be grabbed. Just for demonstration purposes, I'm going to select this box here. But ultimately, we want to do this with the spheres that are inside of an urn. If I want this cube to be interactable, then it's going to need a rigid body, as any sort of physics object inside Unity typically does. And then you're going to need to add an AVR grabbable script to it. There you go. Now I can leave this just as it is like this. If you have an object that has multiple colliders, then you can set them in this list. If you don't, then you can just leave it empty. It will pick up automatically the colliders that are attached. And then you've got if you have a rigid body attached to a different part of an object, then you can set it here. Otherwise it will also automatically detect the rigid body. And then you can set an object type. Now if I can see what I can select here, you will note this is empty. That's because scriptable objects that are inside your packages are automatically hidden. You can just click on this eye in the top right to show them, and you will see there's a number of sort of pre-built types that you can use. The simplest one is just the light prop or very light prop, which essentially behaves as like an object that doesn't have any sort of mass and that you can just swing around wildly. But you can also create your own sort of types of this scriptable object. If we look at the very light prop, you can see it's just got a certain follow type, it's got a certain lightness value, an angular lightness value, and a sort of distance at which the grab is broken. And that is all we need to interact with it. If I now hit play, then this will just work out of the box. But one very sort of recommended setting is to go into project settings and where is it? It is under time, and set the fixed time step to 90 Hertz. So that would be 0.011111. The reason for this is that most VR headsets, like the Vive, have a refresh rate of 90 Hz, and when the refresh rate and the fixed time step are not in sync with each other, or rather when the fixed time step is much larger than the refresh rate, then the rigid body updates are going to appear fairly jagged. So that should fix that issue, and if we now hit play, you'll be able to see that I'm able to interact with that cube there. So as you can see, I can grab the object. This object is arguably way too large to be grabbed in this kind of manner, because you can see with the basic grab provider, you grab the object by their center. So now where we can interact with objects, we want to just start putting down these sort of basic elements of the experiment. And we're just going to start off with a table. For that, I'm just going to use a scaled up cube. There we go. This cube will just serve as our sort of table. The player will be standing in front of it and looking out in the Z direction. Now we need to place like an urn on top of it. I've got a 3D model prepared here. If you want to follow this tutorial, this is just, you can find the link to this in the description. I'm just going to pull this into my assets. So next up, we're going to create the balls that go inside the urn. I'll just create a simple 3D sphere. Let's reset it and place it nearby. Obviously, this is a little bit too large, so I'm going to just resize it to a 1/10. And then we are going to place it above the urn so that it falls into it. There we go. Now we're going to need a color for it, so I'm going to create a new material, and let's just create like a red color, make it red, apply it to the ball, and there it is. In order to make the ball interactable, as we've seen with the cube earlier, we're going to need a rigid body. Now, one thing that happens fairly often when you're using mesh colliders, such on this urn, together with like many small objects like these balls, is that they tend to leak through the mesh collider. And easiest way to solve this is to just set the collision detection to continuous speculative. And the mass of the ball should also be something sort of realistic, so I'm just going to set it to 0.1 for like 100 grams. In our case, if you're using the basic grab provider and the very light object type, it really doesn't matter, but for some of the heavy object types, the mass of the rigid body does make a difference as to behavior. So lastly, we're going to add an AVR grabbable object to it. And for the object type, we are going to just select a very light prop. And now we're going to need a second variant of this. Just duplicate it and create a new material, which we're going to make blue. So just select some blue color and apply to it. Now we've got two different kinds of colors. And lastly, we are going to want to just add it to a different parent. Otherwise, our hierarchy will be we won't have a very good overview of it. So I'll just create an object called urn. We'll add the urn itself to it, as well as both of the spheres. And now we are going to just use a sort of sensible camera position and duplicate the spheres a whole lot so that there's a bunch of them. And once you run out of space above the urn, what you can do is you can just select all of the spheres, duplicate that, and just go up a layer. So that seems to be about 42 spheres. That should be enough for our purposes. And if I now hit play, you'll be able to see that I can grab these spheres out of this urn. So there you go. As you can see, I can just like reach over into the urn, and when I press the trigger button, I grab the sphere that is nearest to the grab point that we looked at earlier.